Hello.
Hey, sorry, I'm still figuring this out. I think I got it.
No, that's awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Of course, I've never been on Discord, but I've heard a lot about it.
Nice. What about Twitch?
um, I just know it as like that's where gamers stream and stuff, and like I'm kind of afraid that if I start, I'll never stop.
Right on. Well, yeah, it started out as gaming, but it's spreading into politics and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I'm interested in occupational licensing stuff, and I've done a little bit of it, and I figured it'd be cool to have you come on and kind of explain how you got into it, explain kind of what's going on with it, explain what's important about it, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, of course, I'd love that.
Cool. So, how did you? I guess can you introduce yourself to us?
Sure.
How'd you get into it and that kind of thing?
I'm like the biggest nerd there is. It's like it's pretty bad. I've been in politics since I was 14. I for a while it was partisan Republican stuff, but over time I saw that both sides are the same in a lot of ways and cause a lot of corruption. And what opened my eyes to that is I've been a Federalist Society member since I was 16, and when I came to college at GW here in DC, I was able to attend the National FedSoc conventions, which were great. And that's where I met Randy Barnett, who's like one of the godfathers of the philosophy that like promotes protecting unenumerated rights in court, that IJ, the Institute for Justice, believes in. And then when you learn about unenumerated rights, it's kind of like you just go straight to Clark Neely and learn about that kind of the kind of work where it's applied, the kind of people it hurts. So it's been a long, weird path. And then over the years, I left politics to work at the Weekly Standard, which is now dead. And then shortly thereafter came to the R Street Institute, where like I'd been writing about occupational licensing reform for years because I'm a giant nerd. And then at R Street, it just kind of all fit. So I've been able to dive into it in ways that I never imagined. Like there's a million angles to the issue. It hurts so many people in ways you would never imagine. And the coronavirus issue has been a new angle for me. I thought a lot about licensing in the scope of limiting access to healthcare unnecessarily, but I never imagined that there would be like a pandemic where licensing would get in the way of people getting care. So the past couple of weeks have been kind of wild and a new side to my work.
Cool. So, do you have a law degree?
No, I'm just a giant nerd.
Okay. Are you interested in getting a law degree?
No, not at all.
Why is that?
Um, I hated school. I do much better in the workforce. Even during school, my GPA sucked. It was like a 2.8 because I just didn't care. But I would get like straight A's in like constitutional law and regulations. So for
Nice.
me, it's just like the nerding is the fun part. But I don't think I would enjoy law school. I don't enjoy school generally.
Cool.
I'm very much like a self starter, you know?
Right. Yeah. But you are familiar with IJ apparently, very
Oh,
much
I'm
so, huh?
obsessed. For a while, they recognized me as like their number one fan.
That's awesome. Yeah, I felt so lucky because I got to work at IJ's Miami office when I was in law school,
That's awesome. What year were you there?
2010 through 2013.
Okay, cool. So that was in 2013 is when I learned about IJ's work. But that's really cool. You get to live in a nice area and like work with IJ.
Yeah,
That's
but
pretty sweet.
yeah, so we did mostly I did some like private property stuff. I did some like like a beekeeper case, I think. But I don't think I did some like maybe First Amendment stuff too, like free speech
Oh,
and private
awesome.
property rights, but I didn't actually get to work directly on the licensing reform. But like I remember we were discussing one case where it was like the, the state of Florida was requiring like thousands and thousands of hours of education and all of these different requirements to do eyebrow threading.
Oh yeah. Um,
And it just seems
it's
so bizarre.
It is. It's ridiculous. Florida's been really abusive too, in a lot of different ways. Like with occupational licensing to give diet advice. Some states don't have a license at all, or like they don't require you to get a license. In Florida, they did sting operations on a military spouse for giving diet advice. She started her business in California where she didn't need a license. It was fine. She did fine. Um, But when she moved to Florida, she needed a license. So they were literally doing sting operations on her for just like telling people to eat less carbs and like, you know, maybe have a vegetable now and then. Like that was illegal. And only this year was that repealed because Florida's been really good with deregulation under DeSantis and with a bunch of the senators. But the wild thing was like government resources were being put into that. Meanwhile, there were unlicensed surgery clinics operating and like killing people. And it took much longer for them to get to that than the military spouse giving people health advice.
Cool. By the way, before I forget, do you mind if I put this video of our discussion on YouTube after this?
Yeah, for sure. Go for it.
Okay, sweet. Can you like start at the beginning and explain to the viewers here like what is occupational licensing and why is it bad and how far do you go with sort of opposing it?
So basically, you know, you might think that a doctor has a license, and that makes sense. In a lot of cases, people are fine with having teacher licenses. But what about when it comes to arranging flowers or braiding hair? Right now, it's something like a fourth of the economy requires people in the economy in the U.S. require a license to work. That was like 5% decades ago, and the growth hasn't protected people. There, for example, with cosmetology, anything from hair braiding to painting nails, doing hair in different capacities. A lot of people will make the argument, oh, well, you know, you have to make sure that there's no infections, that all the stuff is taken care of. But nail salon or salons in general have wildly high rates of infections, so the licensing isn't helping. Like it's really bad. I even went to one a couple of years ago for a pedicure and came out with an infection. And these are all licensed salons. For me, my equation kind of comes down to why do you want a license? Is it something the government can solve? Is it or is it, you know, you just want people to be qualified, something that Yelp could handle? But whenever there's a real health or safety risk, I'm very sympathetic. For example, licensing doctors and nurses. But when it's not about when it's not actually about health or safety and it's just about protecting incumbent industries, that's where I draw the line. And figuring that out isn't that hard because so a lot of the things that are licensed in one or two states or even 40 aren't licensed everywhere. So in Louisiana, it's the only state that has a license to arrange flowers. There's no evidence that all the other states are facing these mass amounts of harm because they don't have licensed florists. It's just to protect the incumbent industry. And there have even been tests showing that like there was no connection between the license and the outcome. And you know, even with hair braiders, especially African immigrants who will come to the United States to braid hair. And when they come here and they can't work, you know, you see the different rates across states. Licensing just stops people from getting into the industry. And sometimes that's okay when it's like doctors and you want to make sure your doctor's qualified. But when there's no evidence of harm and they just want to increase licensing for its own sake, that's when you have a problem.
Okay. So would you say is it fair to say that the licensing laws and regulations actually hurt the people that they're allegedly supposed to be helping?
Constantly, especially because when you license something or add any kind of regulations, it's always going to raise prices and reduce access. And sometimes that's okay when those regulations are really necessary. But when you're stopping someone from braiding hair or you're licensing fortune tellers, which I know in at least a handful of localities, there's a license to be a fortune teller. You know, that it ends up raising prices so the poorest can't afford it, reducing service. And sometimes there's other effects you wouldn't even think about. There was a Mercatus study that had shown that where you license electricians, there's actually higher rates of harm because prices are higher. So people are more likely to try to be an electrician themselves in their own house and harm themselves. While if you don't have licensing, in that case, there's more electricians and they're able to help out more. So, you know, even though I wouldn't be opposed to the concept of it, you have to see how regulations play out in reality.
Right, right. Um, what are some of the arguments that you've seen like pro licensing people make, especially with the things like florists and stuff like that, which on its face doesn't seem to be like any possible way to defend that.
It's funny. Clark Neely at IJ had litigated that, I think, almost 15 years ago now when he was at IJ. Um, and the if I remember correctly, I think the arguments were, well, what about if someone has infected dirt, like whatever that means, or what if like a thorn hurts someone? You'll basically hear all these what ifs and zero evidence, and that's how you know it's crap. Like it's just crap. And some people are even well intended and are genuinely concerned. Some of them aren't and just want to protect their industry. But that's why it has to come down to evidence of harm. Like I was saying with the electricians, you want to study to make sure that the regulations are having their intended outcomes, because even good regulations for good reason can have bad consequences. But like, for hair braiding, they'll say stuff like, oh, you're going to spread infection everywhere. And what if the person's not really good at hair braiding? Then you unbraid the hair, like it's fine. Or if you have a bad haircut, like from King of the Hill, like Bill says, it will grow back. There's people are the people who defend it make it sound like licensing guarantees some minimum level of quality, but licensed professionals of all kind, you look on Yelp and you look at reviews, and I'm sure you've had some bad experiences with some. I have rainbow hair and I do it myself, but when I had gone to one salon to fix the bleach, it's kind of hard for me to do the bleach myself before I dye, and she did a terrible job. So I just don't go to her anymore. She might be great with natural colored hair, but not with mine. It's you just kind of let the economy work itself out.
Right. So, do you think that, I guess, like the internet and all of this access to information that we have now, to me, that seems like a very good thing because people are more likely to be able to determine on their own, like if somebody's good at what they do based on reviews. But would you sort of, even if you didn't have that, what sort of arguments would you make against licensing in terms of sort of the market being able to resolve any issues?
So there's still word of mouth. Not everything has a Yelp page, but your friend might recommend someone who's a really good eyebrow threader, or someone who did really good construction work, and that's not always foolproof. But nor is licensing. Licensing just says that they went through the stuff to have a license. And sometimes licensing even means less accountability, because unless they're violating something really specific, if they're just not great at their job, they're not going to lose their license. But oh, they're licensed. Although the internet really has helped. There was a study. Gosh, I want to say it was like the National Bureau of Economic Research, a really great study that showed that basically, even as far as contractors, reviews kind of get rid of the need for licensing in a lot of cases, because people can easily look up and see how good the quality is. And again, before there were reviews, there was just word of mouth. Maybe independent organizations would give out awards for certain things, like this place has great whatever. I mean, you see restaurants with that, like on the Zagat board or whatever. um, you know Basically, when businesses don't do a great job, they end up going out of business. And that's, it's always kind of worked that way. I don't I And even if someone gets a bad haircut now or then, or someone gets a bad flower arrangement, you have to think about the harm of that versus the harm of getting every single professional to go through thousands of hours of training that may be duplicative to what they've already learned, and then take tests and then pay their fees. It's really off balance in the majority of cases. Of course, not every case, but in a lot of cases, just kind of living one's life and letting bad businesses get that reputation kind of works out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I would think of is that if a business actually harms somebody, they would be subject to a lawsuit potentially.
Right.
And if they damage people, they will be sued. And if they did enough damage, they can get sued, and that will put, a lot of times a lawsuit can put somebody out of business if they did a bunch of harm. And so I think that's something that people
Yeah.
forget too, is that basically just the common law and traditional like lawsuits can handle a lot of these issues, because if they do damage to somebody, they're going to be sued. That also creates an incentive for them to not harm somebody in addition
Right.
to the business, incentives.
Yeah, people always forget we have a legal system. Like, I can't tell you how many times people ask me, well, what's the recourse? And I'm like, well, just like in any other industry, it kind of works the same everywhere. You can go to court, you can sue them, work out something else. I don't know. But it's funny how people forget. And I know it's a burdensome process, but it's still the same recourse you'd have if they were licensed.
Right. So what would you say to somebody who is just like, with especially with like an electrician, I just wouldn't trust somebody, if they didn't have a license.
Then go to the licensed person. I really like trade schools, and it's funny because I find myself opposing them sometimes. But I think that college was a really lacking experience for me, and I know a lot of people feel the same. I love trade schools. I just don't think that someone should go to prison for practicing something without going to one. If they do a fine job, and I'm sympathetic to the argument that sometimes contractors bail after doing a bad job. There's lower barriers you can put in, though, like having them have to register with the government just with their like name and address or something to show so that they can't easily run away, something like that. um so that's one of the most common arguments I get. But if you feel more comfortable with a licensed person, then go to a licensed person. And if you're cool with whatever, then that's fine. I do my own hair. I've learned a lot about how to do it right and wrong over the years, and I do it for my friends sometimes. But if they paid me, it would be against the law, and I think that's kind of silly.
So you wait. Is your position that you're okay if a government entity wants to license somebody, they just shouldn't prevent an unlicensed person from being able to do that work?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the basically, like, if government wants to have that role, I mean, it would end up being more private bodies than anything. But basically, that if someone doesn't have a license, just don't punish them.
Right. So, well, is that different than like accreditation or what's the other word I'm thinking of? Like a certification,
Well,
or
I
do you
mean,
kind of?
and yeah, I mean, I guess licensing boards could still exist if you wanted them to, but I don't know that they'd be as necessary if government stops penalizing people for practicing without a license. Private accreditation bodies are fine, whatever schools people want to go to. I mean, the schools aren't part of government, so it's like they can get the license through those bodies,
Right.
but government just wouldn't be punishing them if they didn't.
Right. So another thing that I would think is that somebody who's going to buy a service from somebody also should probably make sure that that person has insurance, for example.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. There's like IJ has this great my favorite pyramid of least restrictive regulations. And licensing is at the top as most restrictive. The market is at the bottom as least restrictive. And in there you have like insurance, private certification, and other methods like that, health inspections, which might be a good idea instead of licensing for salons, stuff like that. So there's a lot of other ways to go about it. And sometimes those means would be better than the licensing. I mean, in the restaurant industry, not every food worker is licensed, but sometimes the establishment is, or they have, they have health inspections. Like there's a restaurant in DC that closed down a few years ago because it had lots of mice, and the license didn't stop it, but the health inspections did. So
Right. So would you say it's true that these license requirements mostly harm low income individuals?
And not exclusively, but there is a lot of harm on them because they're the ones who can't, even if they can get a loan to go to these schools, they can't afford the opportunity cost of either leaving their family or, whatever else is making it so that so that they don't have a lot of money to begin with. They're the people who can't take the next step up the ladder. Maybe they were trained by their parent or someone close to them in a profession and they can't practice, or in a lot of cases they might have come out of jail and they can't practice because of these good moral character clauses, which say you have to have good moral character to do a variety of things, and good moral character has no legal definition, so it can mean whatever the board wants it to, which has stopped people who have come out of prison. It stopped them from like cutting hair. In one case, a former prostitute who was reformed couldn't become a radiologist because she had had a technical sex crime, as prostitution. Um,
That's
so
terrible.
they Oh yeah, and it was awful. Thankfully, she found out before she went through the process because she had no way of knowing. Someone had just said to her, "Hey, you might want to check this out." If she didn't check into it, she would have gone through the whole process, spent all that money, and still not been able to become a radiologist. Which is why a lot of both justice reformers and licensing reformers advocate that they be able to petition the board and say, "Hey, has this crime that I've committed in the past, will that prevent me from doing this specific um, uh, job and getting this specific license?" Which in certain cases there might be a means ends fit. You wouldn't want a child sex offender working at a school, something like that. But in so many cases, these are so poorly tied together, so people can't get back on their feet. Maybe they went through a rough patch. A lot of people who commit crimes have been victims of crimes themselves, and they can't get on their feet because we have all these arbitrary barriers in the way. Poor people can't get on their feet. There's a guy in Arizona a couple of years ago who was cutting hair for the homeless, and the cosmetology board cracked down on him because he was a cosmetology student, and they said basically, like, if you don't stop, you're never going to get a license from us. The governor had to step in to protect him. Like, he wasn't even making money from it, which shouldn't be the qualification for like cracking down on someone. But a lot of people argue it should. He wasn't even doing that, and like you hear about these cases and all the ways that licensing boards aren't protecting people. They're hurting people. That guy had gone through a lot in his life. He had been to prison, and when he got out, he was getting his life back on track, and they were about to ruin that. You hear, it sounds like a rare story, but I hear stories like that constantly, and you really start to think about the stories like that behind the numbers.
Right. So it's so funny because so often with a lot of these government policies, they honestly they backfire and they don't even help the person they're designed to assist. So for example, I've done a lot of financial services litigation over like the CFPB and like Consumer Protection Act regulations, and like I've literally seen the lawsuits that get filed under these statutes, and 9 times out of 10, these lawsuits are just helping out plaintiffs' attorneys and the people that are sort of harmed by, like, say, a bank doing something to them. Um, they're like just mad because they didn't pay the bill, and then the bank like did something to them, and so then these plaintiffs lawyers take a lawsuit and file a Consumer Protection Act suit or a CFPB violation suit, and the plaintiffs lawyers end up getting a bunch of money, and the other person maybe does, but in turn, the banks will then just crank up their fees and crank up all of these other things to pay for it, and so the government passes these laws to like try to help like individuals, and it actually just ends up increasing the costs on people. And so it seems to me with like these licensing things, there's a lot of that too, where it's like they're not even achieving their own stated goals, right? I mean, they're
Oh,
not, it's not even
constantly.
making it safer.
Part of the reason that I'm so passionate about regulatory reform is just that you see so many areas where regulations are harming the people they're intended to help. Sometimes they're not even really intended to help those people. It's like to help a vested interest. Like Louisiana has a legit florist lobby that keeps that law there. Cosmetologists often band together and have really strong lobbies in a lot of states. But even well-intentioned politicians try to protect people and end up hurting them in ways they wouldn't expect. I also work a lot on regulation for social media, and there's a lot of that there where they think they're helping people, and it's going to make everything worse. It's going to make free speech online much worse. And it's really frustrating because people act like regulations don't have costs. Every regulatory compliance has a cost, and that doesn't mean there shouldn't be any regulations, but that you have to weigh the cost and know that there can be unintended consequences, which is part of why I got so into Randy Barnett and IJ, because they believe in the presumption of liberty, where you err on the side of liberty if it's ever like at a crossroads. And in other cases, just politicians don't always listen to experts. I mean, look at AB5 in California. It's heartbreaking. Some of these people I've spoken to out there were disabled, or they had ill family, and working from home with a really flexible schedule worked for them. They lost all their work, and now there's coronavirus, so they can't even get back on their feet. And California refuses to suspend AB5. It's just there. I always see the same dynamic where they're saying they're trying to help people, and the regulations hurt more people than you could ever imagine, and sometimes in really unexpected ways, like with AB5 and coronavirus. It's really frustrating for me. But one thing that I like is that at least I have a lot of followers on Twitter, so sometimes I can ratio the hell out of politicians, and they'll back down now and then, or at least more people will know, so that if the same kind of thing pops up in their area, they'll know, wait, I see this dynamic, I've seen this before. I'll call my senator or whatever. But it's really frustrating seeing this stuff hurt the same people again and again.
So a lot of times I always get this same sort of pushback from people in debating them, and there's like they only accept a proposition if you've got a study showing it. So with this particular issue of these regulations not really doing what they're designed to do and actually harming people, do you have studies that you're aware of that you can link to this or
So,
cite?
one of the biggest scholars on really demonstrating the harms is Morris Kleiner. He's fantastic. He's also the sweetest human being alive, and if I'm correct, I think he's actually left leaning, which is awesome. But he does a lot of work on this area. But one thing to remember too is that it's not, it's proving a negative, because in so many cases these regulations were implemented without evidence of harm. There were maybe an anecdote or two, many what ifs. Well, what if this happened, or what if that happened? Zero evidence, because there's no evidence. In Louisiana compared to other states, you don't see like lower rates of floristry harm, or where hair braiding's licensed versus not licensed, you don't see higher or lower rates of harm. In a lot of cases, those studies hadn't been done, and politicians just legislated on the what ifs, or there ought to be a law. But I'd encourage people who want to know, like, is there evidence to show this hurts people, to look at Morris Kleiner studies, but also to know that regulations cause prices to rise, and there wasn't evidence that stuff was harmful in the first place. I can't remember offhand. I want to say it was two southern states bordering each other. One licensed hair braiding and the other didn't, and it was some crazy mismatch. It was like one state had 200 hair braiders and the other state had like 6,000. And that's not because there weren't people in the state 200 not willing to braid. It's because of those regulations. It's also really hard to see what you stop from happening. So when you put in regulations that stop some activity, it's hard to know who saw that and decided, well, I'm not going to pursue that. The best way you can figure it out is by looking state to state, and especially similar states, or either states with similar economies or in similar areas, and where one licenses and the other doesn't. And in the case of the hair braiding, I wish I could remember the article that pointed that out, but I'm sure it wouldn't be hard for me to re-find. But the evidence is pretty damning on a lot of this stuff.
So, how do you think we got here? I kind of see potentially two ways. One is politicians um, just passing these laws and regulations because they've got a good soundbite, and hey, I'm gonna protect I'm gonna protect you, I'm gonna protect you. I'm gonna pass all these laws, or it's the lobbyists and the special interest groups of these powerful business organizations and entities that lobbied for it. Or do you see a combination, or
Yeah, it's
both?
definitely both. You have to look case to case, and you can figure out how it happened. For example, in Connecticut, last year they finally licensed manicurists, and there was evidence that the politician pushing it had close ties to the cosmetology lobby, but she also marketed it as, "Oh, look how safe I'm keeping you from the dangers of unlicensed uh, people who paint your nails." While in Oklahoma, I want to say it was, gosh, I think it was either a year or two ago. I think it was last year, where this guy tried to license qigong, which is the ancient Chinese art of energy work. My mom practices it because she is a hippie, and my colleague and I talked with her about it, because I just kind of like tune out some of her hippie stuff, but I like, Mom, I actually need your help here. Can you like fill us in? And I did some research on it and looked into it more. The ancient Chinese art exists legitimately in like thousands of forms, but this one senator thought, it's time for a licensing board. Thankfully, that stopped, and there were actually local qigong practitioners who were like, "What the fuck? Like, what?" And fought him on it. So it was nice to see the industry being like, "Leave us alone." You get that sometimes, but where they're more organized, you get them pushing for more and more licensing. Um, you know, the way the lobbies come together kind of makes it obvious. Like I was saying with the cosmetologist in Arizona 2 years ago, they had a big fight to de-license hair blow drying, and like the cosmetologists were yelling, "Well, do you want immigrants blow drying your hair?" And I'm like, "I don't know, I don't care. Like whoever's gonna do
Wow.
it, fine." And others were like, "Oh, it's so dangerous. You know that the hair blow dryers can get really hot." Like we've all most girls have used one, a lot of guys have used one, and they finally delicensed it last year, which makes it now one of only 2 states where you don't need a license to blow dry hair. But the way the
Wow.
lobbies come together make it really really obvious, but there are some well-meaning politicians who are just like, they don't think through shit.
Right, right. So, somebody in my chat asked, what do the licensing fees go towards?
So usually maintaining the licensing board, it all depends on the state and the structure. I'm not as well versed on that only because I think in some states like it goes towards larger pools, but generally it's like maintenance of the licensing board, which also often pulls funds from other areas. Although at my think tank, we generally argue that like, hey, if you're gonna do the stuff, at least put the fees towards a thing that you're charging it for, so that like you don't have more unaccountable fee structures, which is one really nerdy thing I won't bore you too much with.
Well, it seems to me like that would create a huge conflict because don't the politicians then, when these delicensing laws come up, don't the politicians say, well, the licensing board told us that, we have to do this, otherwise there's going to be all this terrible stuff that's going to happen.
Oh yeah, I mean that's part of why deregulation is always way harder to happen than regulation, because it's doing something versus oh well, what if? But you can have innumerable what ifs, but there's never data, like ever. I literally don't think there has been one time I've worked on delicensing something where I have found any study showing, well, if you delicense this, this will happen. Like ever. Evidence is never on their side. Because if it was, I probably wouldn't be fighting it. I'd be like, oh yeah, we should license doctors and like, stuff like that. That does end up putting politicians in a hard place where they're like, oh, these Republicans want to deregulate everything, but they forget it hurts poor people, and I don't think hurting poor people is cool. So
Right. Well, don't I mean is do you see a clear partisan divide on this stuff? Because it seems to me that I've also seen plenty of Republicans be opposed to licensing deregulation.
oh yeah, I mean on the state level it's really split. I would say not always, but a lot of the biggest licensing reformers are on the right side, and a lot of the worst abusers are both right and left. There's definitely exceptions to it, but it ends up that it's more Republicans trying to remove licensing. One great exception to that is Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado. He's awesome. He like got rid of 3 licenses last year, and he called me and we talked about it, and like he was
Nice.
he was just like, hey, this is dumb, and I'm like, I love you, you're awesome. One of them was like getting rid of an HOA license, like the to be head of the HOA, because like HOAs
Wow.
are bad enough. And he's like, we're not going to license this. And I'm like, you were awesome. And Joe Biden, actually, a lot of the Democratic presidential candidates talked about licensing reform, which made me happy. Like, the more the merrier. And in Pennsylvania, Governor Tom Wolf is into licensing reform. Less so, I don't think he understands the broader philosophy of it, like I think Polis does. But I have to give him a lot of credit that after Doug Ducey in Arizona made the state the first to like basically make it easy to transfer in your license from another state, which is mobility is a huge issue with licensing. Pennsylvania followed suit with a very similar law, not as good, but to have it, especially a Democratic governor, be the second one to follow right after a red state, that was really cool. So there's exceptions, but the majority of licensing reformers tend to be Republican. But Republicans are really bad abusers of licensing too. Local politics is corrupt as shit.
Right, for sure. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I mean, It's like it seems like the Republicans have their own sort of specific industries they enjoy licensing. So, for example,
Oh yeah.
it might be like breweries or or bars and pubs or um, I don't know what are some of
Yeah.
the industries that you see like the Republicans supporting.
I want to say that in Louisiana, they're the reason for the florist thing. Um, I haven't, it's interesting. I haven't seen them push as much in specific industries on the local level. Like it's definitely not an industry party thing, except on the national level. One of the things I do is try to like stop regulations that stop almond milk from calling itself almond milk or veggie meat or cauliflower rice. Republicans love regulating that stuff because, oh, well, how can you tell the difference between like cow milk and almond milk? Everyone will think they're ridiculous, no evidence of harm. So I'm regularly yelling at Republicans about that. I love uniting like people who you think of as more liberal, like hippies. I'm a vegetarian, so I love being like, "Hey, here's my vegetarian side and my regulatory reform side. Here they are together now." Um, but you know, Republicans are really bad abusers, which is also like when they talk a lot about, oh, you know, we get deregulation. I'm like, let's see. Like some of you,
Right.
yes, but many of you, watch out.
Somebody said, if my personal blow drying operator doesn't have a $400 license and 4 years of rigorous training, I can't sleep at night.
No, that's fair because you never know what will happen the next day if your hair's just going to explode. I've had that. That's why I stopped going to one unlicensed salon. It's so bad.
Do you think licensing can be a means of accountability?
No, not at all. I mean, lots of licensed people suck. They just really suck. Um, you know, I sympathize with the method, but it's less about accountability, more like even with doctors, there's issues. I mean, I'm not saying we should get rid of doctors' licenses, but here's one example: the nurses and the doctors are fighting all the time. Like, it's especially lately, people have started to take notice more. Doctors don't want nurses to expand their scope of practice just to things they were qualified for, and to be able to practice on their own. And right now, like, we're really trying to reduce doctor burnout. So, giving pharmacists and nurses more flexibility, many studies have shown it works. That they still work with doctors, especially pharmacists, to you know, keep prescriptions updated, but that giving them some more flexibility helps in the healthcare workflow. But a lot of doctors don't want nurses, especially more so nurses and pharmacists, to have expanded flexibility because that ends up meaning less money for doctors. And it's funny because you see like the AMA fighting like the Nurses Association a lot on it. So you still get those lobbied interests at any time, and it's like, especially, I mean, doctors aside, on industries like, especially more in cosmetology and construction, you still get more accountability through the market than you do through licensing. Lots of terrible lawyers also have licenses. It doesn't really keep anything accountable, unfortunately. And thankfully, the internet has stepped in. And I'm not saying Yelp is the solution to everything, but I'm also saying that licensing isn't the solution to everything.
I agree with that. I definitely agree that there's a lot of bad lawyers out there. And
Oh, yeah.
it seems to me that a lot of times like the people with the licenses and the licensing boards are more concerned with protecting their own than they are about anything
Oh,
else.
yeah.
And so like a lot of time, I mean, cuz like with a lawyer, if you file a license complaint against a lawyer, it's going to be other lawyers deciding whether that lawyer violated some
Yeah.
rule and should be. And so like there's like almost like this protect our own mentality amongst the
Oh,
licensing
yeah.
board, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's exactly why you have them fighting to keep the licenses because it puts them in these demi-government bodies to protect one another. They turn into guilds, and it's frustrating. And the things they'll put into place. I mean, like, you know, in Louisiana, for example, to pass the florist exam, you had to arrange flowers and also take a written test. And the pass rate was lower than the Louisiana bar exam. Like, that's the stuff that happens when you intertwine business and government and say you guys are going to work together super well. Now, public-private partnerships are great. I think that that's a really great use that they done right, they can work out very well. But when you say, hey, we're going to send you to jail or fine you until you can't afford the fees and then you have to go to jail, um, for practicing this without a license. There has to be a really, really good reason. And medical licensing is one of those because, black market unlicensed surgery clinics and other things like that have killed people. And like you never you never find out about the underground doctor who's doing really great work. Like that's not a thing. Like, oh wow, that guy, like I get why he didn't get a license. Like that's never something that happens. But you often hear about people cutting hair for the homeless and getting punished, stuff like that. So I think that's one really great example to kind of show you why. And with doctors, I know we don't have a pure way to study it, but like again, there's just never been like a really great underground doctor.
Right. So, well, how do you use the point of the fact that there was never a really great underground doctor to argue in favor of licensing reform?
Well, I mean, like people generally don't perform surgeries on themselves either, but people do people braid hair for one another without a problem. Moms cut hair at home. People mow their own lawns and like sometimes do home construction. And a lot of construction licenses are like super duplicative. It's ridiculous. New Jersey, I think they finally passed it, and I don't think it passed the year that I wrote about it in 2017. But they tried to license pool contractors because they said, "Oh, that'll prevent drowning deaths." So I pulled the data, compared like per capita, like pool. Basically, I tried to see if there was a rate change in pool drowning deaths, by state, seeing like the ones that were licensed versus ones that aren't. And there was no difference because that doesn't stop drowning deaths at all. It also had a good moral character clause because, of course, and I'm like, stop. America has a great history of amoral pool boys, so don't you dare. It's basically like people do unlicensed things all the time that if they were to do that thing to someone else and exchange money, that would be illegal. And it's silly. But again, like it's not like you're gonna have your buddy Joe come over and you're gonna do some surgery on him and it's gonna work out really great. And again, it's hard to compare scientifically because doctors are licensed everywhere, which is a good thing. But for the rest of these professions, where they're licensed, where they're not licensed, you don't really see a difference in quality. I don't even know what the fortune teller's license is meant to do. Like some people are like, oh, it restricts supply. And I'm like, yeah, but these fortune tellers now have a government permission slip saying I'm the real fortune teller. Like it's nonsense. But whenever you compare the data, you see that there's no difference. Licensing doesn't help. All it does is stop people from getting into the industry, whatever that is, even fortune telling, and that it's just not helpful.
Okay. There was one question. Are there any licenses that have worked as intended? I'm going to say the answer to that is no.
I mean, none I think work perfectly as intended. Some are worth it though, even if they're not perfect, like the doctor's license. There's a lot of problems in the system from like residencies that, you have these people graduating medical school and then they can't become a doctor because they don't get a residency. Like there's kinks in the system, but it's still better than having unlicensed doctors. But basically for most of the ones that I'm looking at, like as it applies to cosmetology, that they really aren't worth it. And data shows that it's not worth it.
Okay, there's a couple of questions about CDL licenses. Some say some lines of work it's necessary. Would you trust someone on the road in a big rig weighing 80,000 pounds without a CDL?
Yeah, I haven't gotten into those as much, in part because I'm kind of fine with them. I haven't really studied those as much. And we all have driver's licenses, and people who drive bigger vehicles need licenses. I'm kind of fine with those. I know that there's some people have brought up some issues with them. I just haven't looked deep enough into it. But most of my areas of study are where there's like, the risks are so hypothetical that I'm just trying to show people that they're entirely hypothetical. But with this, I could understand.
Okay, do you have any ideas on who should ideally be in charge of the licensing when it is deemed necessary, for example, with the doctors or the CDLs? Or do you think the current setup for those, who's in charge of the licensing on those is okay?
It depends. I think one thing that's been a really good idea that a couple of states have been looking at is just having more public board members. Like you want to have you have to have industry insiders who understand the industry, but you also need accountability. So more non-industry people, maybe people who work in similar industries. I mean, like in medical licensing, there's a lot to change. I also don't understand why you have to go to undergrad that can be unrelated in order to go to like med school down the line, or even to become a lawyer you can study art and then go to law school. I think truncating a lot of those to just the necessary things would make a little bit more sense. There's a lot of different ways to change it to make the structure just more accountable. um, these boards also need more oversight, and they need to report their data more. They just don't report data. They're not required to, so they don't. And there's been a lot of projects over the years for other areas of government to like open the books, like, and many of them have been called like open the books or open books, whatever state. But government just needs to get better with collecting and reporting its data so people can see what's working and what's not. Sunset regulations are great. Like, hey, this is going to sunset unless you guys renew and have evidence that it should renew. But a lot of times sunsets are overlooked. So there's a couple of different ways to go about it. I think it might even just depend on the state how to go about it, but there's a million ways to just make regulations more accountable and make sure that they're serving their purpose. The reviews are really important too, because just like with the cosmetology licensing, like I've been saying, health inspections might just be the better thing because there's like rampant health abuses, and clearly health inspection isn't a big enough part of all of it. And there's so many studies on that where it's like, I don't know why we haven't shifted the system, except that just government stagnates sometimes. So getting government out of like stagnating in what it's doing is a really hard thing to do. And there's just a lot of people trying to figure out the best way to do that right now. So I think there still needs to be some more experimentation, but taking regulatory sunsets more seriously, I think, is one way to go about that.
So when you say the health inspections, you're saying that get rid of the license to be able to do this, but still have health inspectors come in and make sure the places are healthy.
Yeah, and not only is it a lower regulatory burden, but I think it just might be more effective. When you compare the restaurant and cosmetology industry, you see a clear difference there. And people, I think that the rates of getting sick, or infections from cosmetology from salons ends up being quite a bit higher than people getting sick at restaurants, and that tells you that maybe a system more like that might be worth it, or maybe something else. There's a lot of regulatory options, and we have to stop like hitting everything with a hammer first.
Right. So wait, I'm not sure if I caught that. You're saying there's more evidence of people getting sick?
Like infections at salons
Oh,
than
versus restaurants?
yeah,
Even
yeah,
though
like
the
then
even though the salons are more licensed?
right, exactly.
Okay,
And
interesting.
all the workers have to jump through more hoops, with few exceptions depending on the state too. But basically salons aren't staying healthy and safe, while restaurants just end up being more accountable. And I think that might be just because of the different regulatory structures.
Okay. Um so one of the big sort of points I could see somebody making is that this is all great and this is all true, but people aren't smart enough to know what they're doing in life. We can't trust people to do it. We need the government to make sure that everything is safe, because you're asking a whole lot for people to be able to, listen to word of mouth and read reviews, and like we need the government to protect us. What would you
I
say to
mean, in
that?
in states where there's not licensing, there's no higher evidence of harm in most cases. In some cases, it's actually higher evidence of harm where things are licensed. So, all you have to do is go and look at the data to figure out a lot of the stuff, and also figure out the harms that are occurring because people can't get into the profession, they can't practice, services cost more. So basically, I go back to a lot of that. And also, for most people, especially like if you want to get a good haircut, you might ask a friend where to go, or you might just Google like, haircut near me and see the reviews. If it's 1 star, you're probably not going to go there, maybe unless you're in a real rush. But I know when I go to restaurants and stuff, I'll Google beforehand, in part because I'm vegetarian and want to see if I can eat anything there. But also, if they have really bad reviews, I might suggest to like a friend, hey, maybe we don't go here. It's fairly simple, and like licensing isn't solving the problem either. So it's better to cut away the costs and let people decide for themselves.
Cool. We've almost been talking for an hour, so I guess the last thing I'm kind of curious about is um, what's sort of like the latest going on in licensing reform, and if you could maybe talk about how successful do you think the efforts to um, actually, I just thought of I meant to ask you this earlier. What's the big reason to do it, and sort of what's the big benefit of doing licensing reform? Why should people care about this? Like, is it jobs? Is it freedom? Like, what are the big reasons to do this?
I mean, there's so many benefits. Mobility is another one. So basically, when you reduce those regulatory barriers and you reduce licensing, poor people can afford more, or more people, sorry, more poor people can afford more services. You stop criminalizing stuff that shouldn't be criminal. You stop sending more people into the justice system who don't need to be there. More freedom, which is a benefit in itself. More jobs. And mobility is one really big factor. One of the big licensing reform movement things of the past year or two has been the Arizona model, where people can transfer in their licenses easily. It's better, not in all cases, but in the majority, it's better than compacts for a long list of reasons. Basically, like it opens up everything. One really big issue is people can't move to another state if they, because their license doesn't transfer. So if I were to move somewhere and I was a teacher, I would have to spend a whole process to get relicensed, and that's a huge deal for anyone, let alone military spouses. A lot of the horror stories come from them because they have to move with their spouse, and they're like, "Look, I can't afford to get relicensed. It's a wild process." They've made that process easier for military spouses in a lot of states, but what if they move from somewhere without a license to somewhere with a license? Then their license can't transfer, and then you have sting operations and a military spouse for providing diet advice. It's all these wild things, and like, I don't go by anecdotes. I just try to show the data with stories attached to them, so this is the face of that data point.
Right.
This is the person who's hurt.
That's what I've always thought IJ does so
Yeah.
good with. And what's great too is what, like you were saying, when you can pick somebody who is sort of sympathetic to the left. So, maybe it's somebody who's really into vegan food, and
Yeah.
they're trying to tell people to eat vegan food, and then they get shut down for not having a dietitian license. Or
Oh, yeah.
it's somebody that's, like doing almond milk, or it's somebody that's trying to keep bees at home, or it's,
Right.
these different things that, maybe Democrats would be like, wow, that is kind of ridiculous. And most of the time when you actually tell the actual story, any reasonable person is going to be like, okay, that is ridiculous.
Right. And people think it's the exception to the rule, but it's most often the rule. But I agree with you. And IJ taught me a lot about how to message this stuff just from me reading their work and knowing their people. I learned a lot about them from it. And I hope that I've adopted a lot of their strategy and built upon it, because they really did great with putting a face to it. And one thing that I think all sides, I'm a very big Arthur Brooks person, where I think we yell at each other too much when we have lots of stuff in common and can like show each other that like we might come from different perspectives, but our goal is the same. Like, we want to end up helping people. And my parents are hippies. My dad's a libertarian. My mom does not care. Like, she doesn't know who people are. I'm not so sure she knows what my job is, but they're hippies, and like they're people in, I guess, me too, just from like being like a woman and Jewish and like with dyed hair and vegetarian. You would think that we're all on the left side, but I have good reasons for being where I am. And I think when you can show people, hey, we might disagree on this stuff, but this is someone that I think you might be able to relate to, or someone who you can kind of understand that they're in a bad situation and they shouldn't have to be there. Whether from the left to the right or the right to the left, I think it just opens a lot of minds.
Totally. Yeah. Well, and I mean, I always tell people, like, one of the reasons I'm conservative is because I care about poor people, and I want low income people to have more opportunities and to be better off. And it's like there's this meme on the left that like conservatives hate poor people and hate immigrants and
Yeah,
stuff like that. And like, I can't stand that because like I think my policies, conservative policies, small government policies, actually help out immigrants,
yeah.
help out low income people, blah 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 blah. So that's another thing that I think is really important in messaging this is that like, look, we're doing this to try to help out vulnerable populations. We're doing this to try to help out people who Democrats and liberals say that they care about.
Totally. I mean, I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal. I think it was last year or the year before. I lose track of time, but it was basically about how regulations hurt the homeless. So whether it's the guy being punished for cutting hair for the homeless, like that's messed up. And thankfully, Governor Ducey, who is like my favorite human being alive, he's like, he stepped in and said, "This guy's being a good Samaritan. We should not be punishing him for this." In so many cases, it's illegal to feed the homeless. Like you can't give them food or you can't like donate food. Like Bloomberg had outlawed a lot of food donations because he's like, oh, I don't want them having carbs. And I'm like, just make sure they have food. Like that's the first step. Other places have burned food, bleached food, and it's disgusting. And in Georgia, that happened last year where they were putting these ridiculous regulations on a church that had fed like literally like what was something like 250,000 sandwiches to hungry kids. They were shutting them down. The ministries worked really hard to be compliant, and now the ministries is like partnering with the local school district to feed the kids. And it makes me so mad that they put all these restrictions. There was not one complaint. It wasn't like one guy was like, oh, this like sandwich really hurt my kid. It's like they were working out fine and they just stopped them. There was another case where someone was stopped from like sheltering the homeless. Um, it drives me up a wall because like I've never been homeless or poor, but I have family who have been through the justice system or homeless or poor in other ways, and it's like, I wouldn't want someone being told you can't help them out if they need a hand. You can't cut their hair if they need a haircut before they go in for a job interview, or like you can't let them sleep inside your house in the freezing cold winter. It's really sick. And I know that like I know people don't always realize that government can turn to this stuff, but if you don't watch over it and if you let them have too much power over your life, stuff like this can happen.
Totally. Okay, now I'll ask you how successful do you think the licensing reform movement has been over the last whatever 10, 20 years? What are the big issues right now? What's your prediction on the future? Do you think you're going to be completely successful on this and you're not going to have any more need to continue to work on this issue, or do you think this is like are you pessimistic about the future, or what are your thoughts on that?
I can dream, but I think you're going to see a lot more reciprocity. The Ducey model has caught on, and I really think it's the fact that like the next state to do it was in Pennsylvania, and a blue state with a blue governor. I think that really gave it a lot of steam. My last count was like a month or two ago, but there were like 20 states with similar models going through their legislatures. I don't know where they are now because of like everything going on, but there's been a lot of focus there. So I think you're going to see a lot more reciprocity. Some de-licensing depending on the area, some more licensing. Cosmetologists are really like locking down a lot of their licenses, with the exception of hair braiding. That started to go away. I would love to get rid of the florist license in Louisiana. That is my white whale. Like, oh my gosh, every damn year, like they try and like they won't let it happen. And it's frustrating, but I think there's some licenses I think you might see go away. Some new licenses, unfortunately, but I think the big change is just going to be a lot more reciprocity, which is good because you want people to be able to move, and definitely more military spouse bills to make it even easier for them. But in the wake of coronavirus, I think you're also going to see a lot more flexibility with medical licensing, and nothing crazy, just maybe more state compacts and more flexibility for nurses and pharmacists, things that are helping to make this crisis a little bit better. One thing that I'm really hopeful about too is that both New Jersey and New York have let foreign doctors waive in their licenses. I'm not saying people should be able to come here and have no tests. I'm sympathetic that you want to make sure their training's up to standard, but I think we also need to make it a little bit easier for immigrants to come here to transfer in their licenses, because I'm not sure about other people, but I and a lot of people I know doctors from other countries who didn't want to go through the whole process again here. So they're doing other jobs, and sometimes they're janitors or Uber drivers. And it feels kind of wrong that like my Uber driver can't help someone who's sick under the law in any way. So I think that there's going to be more openness in medical licensing, which I wouldn't have thought very long ago, just because, whenever I talk about medical licensing reform and fairly narrow stuff, people are like, oh, you libertarians don't want any licenses and, people dying on the streets. But I think people have really seen that you need that more kind of flexibility there. So I think it's going to be better, a little bit better in medicine and more reasonable and more reciprocity. And then with other professions, I think some of them will go away, and the licensing reform movement's gaining a lot of steam. But I still think I'm going to have a job in a couple of years, unfortunately. I would love
Yeah.
to not, then I'll just go do like almond milk.
So on a scale of 1 to 10, how successful do you think the licensing reform movement has been over the last 10 or 20 years?
I think like a 7. I think it's been really good, as good as it can be, just because the stagnancy and like government not wanting to get rid of regulations is a really hard thing to overcome, and they're able to overcome it in certain ways that is just like would seem impossible. It's not as aggressive as the justice reform movement, which I think has been extremely successful. But I think you're starting to see it take the shape of that, where it's getting more stakeholders involved. So there's definitely room for improvement, but I couldn't imagine where it would be without IJ. Like IJ
Right.
is the reason for so much of this.
Right. Yeah, I mean, throughout history, you almost never see regulations cut. Governments go
Yeah.
one direction. They get bigger, they get bigger, they get more powerful. There's more regulation. So the fact that there's been any amount of cutback, I think, is quite the success.
Oh yeah.
And then I think your point about the coronavirus is really good, because I've been making the point that, look at this, when we have an emergency and these governors and presidents are operating under emergency declarations, most of what they're doing is waiving r- red red tape, and they're waiving regulations, and they're waiving all this stuff, and it's like, okay, so if we need to just get rid of all of this stuff to deal with an emergency, it kind of raises the question of, why do we have it in the first place?
Yeah, exactly. And it's amazing because they're, not just with licensing, but with certificate of need laws, where it's basically competitors veto. Like, you have to get your competitors' permission in order to like add new medical facilities, or in certain cases, permission from the government to add hospital beds. Those laws have been like waived, and for years, everyone was like, "Oh no, you need con laws to stop medical expenses from getting too high and reducing access to care." They're waiving them like in the blink of an eye to expand access, because it's not helping. Like those laws aren't helpful, and they're hurting a lot of people. It's just amazing that it just overnight it's like, yep, we didn't need any of this stuff. So I'm hoping it's a lot of the stuff, like the certificate of need laws, will be repealed.
Yeah, that's just seems insane to me, that we would purposefully limit the amount of medical care that's in the hospital beds that are available.
Yep. And it's, you hear all these stories, especially now, about how we don't have enough hospital beds. I wonder why. Like, you're
Right.
literally arbitrarily limiting it. It's infuriating. It was infuriating before, where like there's this case, I think it was an IJ case in North Carolina, where this doctor wanted to like provide cheaper MRIs, and he couldn't do that because his competitors and the government said no. It's insane. Um, it's really frustrating to me, because regulations get in the way of success for so many things, let alone healthcare all the time. um I'm just really hoping the governments take the lesson. You needed to waive this because these aren't helping. Keep waiving them. Maybe not in full. Like with foreign doctors, I'm sympathetic. Maybe you want them to go through a little more training, but be reasonable. See what they've already done, and don't make them go through a whole residency again if it's identical to their former experience. It's really frustrating, but I'm hopeful that at least some lessons will be taken from all of this.
Agreed. Do you think that there's any big issues that we have not talked about, or that I didn't ask you about?
Oh man, there's a million. Well, on licensing, there's a million sides to the issues. Like in a bunch of states, if you fall behind on student loans, they'll take away your license to work, so you can't work to repay those loans. And a lot of times, they do that to nurses, of whom like we really need right now. Then there's more justice angles and more like I wish that like I had less to talk about. It's it hurts people from so many sides, and I'm so sick of hearing the stories of how it hurts. I just hope people start to realize like this stuff sucks and is hurting people.
Right. Well, do you want to shout out yourself and your social medias and your think tanks and everything you want to talk about? So if people watch this on YouTube and the people that are watching now on Twitch, they know who you are and where to find you.
Sure, I'm on Twitter at Senator Shoshana. I am not a senator. Unless you send me $20,000, and I will be a senator. And my organization's website is rstreet.org. You can find everything else from there. I tweet way too much, and I also run all of our digital media. So R Street will also tweet way too much if you follow at RSI.
Well, cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I would encourage you to maybe start streaming on Twitch yourself. It seems like you could do a pretty good job at it, but I appreciate you coming on. I think it's been really interesting. I will put this on YouTube, and thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Talk to you later.